thought I was born like 200 years too late, because I really like this period. A lot of what was going on in what was considered the Enlightenment period, the period of our founding fathers. And of course I was down there at UVA, which was, I mean, the whole university was designed by Thomas Jefferson. Well, so the empiricists are writing in the period, the late 1600s, the late 1700s. We call them the British empiricists because they're all three from the British Isles. I think I mentioned that. And I sort of, even though I didn't finish my doctorate, this was one area I was working in. And I've been to 2 different conferences over there, which is nice. If you're working on this historical area and you have conferences there in Ireland or Scotland, so I've been to the British Isles twice. Never got to Europe. Anyway, well, so Locke was from England, Berkeley from Ireland, and Hume from Scotland, all part of the British Isles. Along with Wales, we don't have any major philosopher from Wales that I know of. So, this is the view that you and I have had inculcated into us in any class in the sciences or the social sciences, so almost since day one of our schooling. That's why if Plato and Socrates and Descartes claims that somehow reason is an almost mystical faculty that can really get to the bottom of things regarding truth, if somehow those claims seem a little far-fetched and a little unusual, it's because you and I have been trained in a view that says, look, there's something special to reason as a truth-finding faculty. If we really want to find out what the truth of the matter is, if we really want knowledge, it's going to come from observations made with our senses, not from pure reason. So, empiricism, now, again, these pages are from different books, so just disregard them. The philosophy that demands that all knowledge comes from experience. An empiricist maintains that we can know something if we can justify it with respect to what we see, hear, smell, touch, or taste. By our senses. Not by pure reason. Now, this is not a distinction we're going to spend a lot of time on, but some empiricists make a distinction between basic empirical beliefs, that is, empirical beliefs that I have based on what my own senses are immediately telling me, like if there's a black briefcase sitting on the table here, right? Seeing a red telephone produces in me the belief that there is one in front of me, right? I believe that there's a black, briefcase sitting on the table because that's what my senses tell me is happening there. So my seeing the telephone, touching it, handling it, justifies my belief that it's there. Now we can have inferential beliefs that are also basically based on information gathered from the senses, even though it might not be information that's direct, right? None of us have seen a brontosaurus, or any other dinosaur for that matter. But we can have inferential empirical beliefs that are not about what we observe directly, but that we infer from past observations, like, my belief in unseen dinosaurs may be justified by reference to seen and felt fossils and footprints, right? So you're inferring that this skeleton of a huge dinosaur, was once a living animal. Or if you see, and there are preserved brontosaurus footprints. Librarian is doing a video series on the States, and she was in Connecticut, and apparently up there they found dinosaur footprints preserved in stone, which is something I think about more as something they're finding out west in places like Colorado. So that was a surprise to me to see that they had up there. But no, you're still talking about a belief that's based on information from the senses. None of us has gone to Mars, but we gather information, from these rovers that are up there about what's going on the surface of Mars, indirectly. So empiricism, there's a reason why you and I have been trained to be empiricists all of our lives, because it's a very attractive theory of knowledge. It says, hey, you want to have good beliefs? Well, base your beliefs on observational evidence, not just conjecture, not just what you think your abstract reasoning tells you is out there, but get down and observe what's really going on in the world. So beliefs based on empirical evidence seem to be reliable and objective for everyday life, for the sciences. Now, we saw Descartes raising doubts about empirical beliefs, and we're going to see that in these philosophers as well. So historically, there have been problems with perception. In other words, with justifying the knowledge we seem to have based on our senses philosophically. And most of those problems stem from what I was talking about last time, from the fact that Descartes puts us in the egocentric predicament, says that we're immediately acquainted only with our own inner mental life. And that puts a gap between us and the world. And, there's a problem in justifying the claim that I know what's going on in the world if I think that I'm immediately acquainted only with my own sensations, or as Locke puts it, ideas. So some of these problems with perception relate partially to the fact that the empiricists rejected the claim of Descartes and other rationalists, like, even going back to Plato, but other current rationalists, current for them, like Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. Now, we're not going to worry about Spinoza and Leibniz, but they denied that we have any knowledge at birth. Now Locke didn't just say, hey, there aren't any innate ideas like Descartes thinks they're all, take my word for it. No, he didn't do that. Locke's main book on the theory of knowledge. Now, he also wrote books that influenced our founding fathers in their political philosophy. Books like On Liberty, where he discusses the nature of just state and how a just state should preserve, liberty and protect our natural rights and liberty. But Locke's book on the theory of knowledge took him 10 years to write. It was called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And it has 4 books in one. And the stuff we're talking about begins in the second book. But the first book, which we're not going to look at, was where Locke made his case against innate ideas. In other words, he gave one argument after another to try to show that we don't have innate knowledge, as Plato and Descartes thought we did. So Locke didn't just say, hey, look at me, I'm a big shot, I'm John Locke. Believe me when I say there are no innate ideas. But he actually tried to make a case, a philosophical case, against it, which, we can only cover so much. That it's not unusual for a 4-year school with a bigger enrollment and a bigger philosophy department to offer a separate course just in British empiricism, where you're taking a whole semester of that, and you're reading Locke, himself. So here's Locke's famous phrase. He says, that's what the mind looks like at birth. There aren't any innate ideas. In other words, I don't use buy computers anymore. But if you go to Best Buy or you go to Dell online or something, you get a computer nowadays, it's going to have a lot of stuff, a lot of information, an operating system, a lot of software you don't even want on there because they're just demos of things that you're not sure you want. But if we buy a computer, it's already got a lot of information on that hard drive. And that's kind of the way the rationalists look at how our mind is. When we come into the world, when we're born, we already are stocked with innate ideas of things like moral knowledge, innate ideas of God and who God is, innate ideas having to do with the truths of mathematics. There's information on our minds at birth. But for Locke, one of the things he could do with a hard drive, I remember I was doing some volunteer work back when I was thinking of maybe making a career transition about 2000. Timing is everything. I was saying, man, maybe I get into computers. But it was the end of the computer bubble. But anyway, we were sending a bunch of our older machines back then that we just gotten new computers over to, I forget whether it was Kenya or one of the countries in Africa, just as a kind of charitable thing. But we wanted to wipe the hard drives clean and just put a different system on. And so one of my jobs was to wipe the hard drives clean, right? And you can do that by reformatting the drive. Well, that's Locke's view of how we are when we come into the world. Our mind is like a computer hard drive that's been wiped clean, not even an operating system, right? And so how do we get information onto the hard drive of our minds if we're going to persist in that analogy? Well, it's experience that writes. Our minds are like a blank tablet, a blank slate at birth. Experience after we're born. which is basically the view that you and I have been trying. Hey, you know anything? It came by your senses after you were born. Well, now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the ways to defend rationalism is by the claiming that, wait a second, there are some ideas we have that don't relate to anything in this world. Well, we saw Socrates claiming that the only way we can judge that two things are equal but not perfectly equal, right? Like two lines, you know. I suppose I measured them. I mean, these are roughly equal, but they're equal in length, but not perfectly equal in length. Well, Socrates would say, how do you know that? Well, you don't know that unless you know what perfect equality is. And he says, nothing in this world is perfectly equal. No two lines. And so you must have had that idea from birth, because he didn't acquire it in this world. And that's kind of what Descartes and the other rationalists were holding. Ideas, remember, Descartes tries to prove the existence of God from what he thinks is his perfect innate idea of God. So things like ideas of perfection, nothing perfect in this world, ideas of things like the infinite, infinity, and of God, these were claimed by the rationalists to be ideas that we could not have gotten from experience, because there's nothing in experience that directly corresponds to them. So if you're going to deny innate ideas, it kind of is incumbent upon you to provide some sort of alternative account of how we have some ideas that rationalists say can only be innate. And so basically, Locke's strategy is he's trying to say, from the data that we are provided by our senses, we can just, by mental operations, kind of project and make up from whole cloth these innate ideas, that we don't have to have direct experience. So, I mean, the idea of perfection, he says you can begin with something that has imperfections in it. I'm talking about somebody's knowledge of computers, but you could bring it. I mean, think about a flower, right? You know, I mean, it's Easter for a lot of people. You have a beautiful Easter lily. But you say, well, it's not perfect. But what would a perfect Easter lily look like? Well, you'd remove all these little spots you see, this misshapen petal over here. You know, you'd remove the imperfections, and you can come up with an idea of what a perfect Easter lily would be like. And so this is Locke's argument. He says, well, we can come up with an idea of perfection by starting out with something imperfect and kind of mentally imagining what it would be to remove those imperfections and come out in the end with something perfect. So you see what he's arguing. He's saying we start out with something that our senses do provide us with, like an imperfect, experience of an Easter lily, and we mentally remove all the imperfections, and we get an idea of what a perfect Easter lily would look like. Just, I'm not real crazy about my first. And by the way, you'll notice this graphic is upside down of this old computer. This was one of the first PowerPoints I ever made up. And I think I did it on what was then old software. It was like PowerPoint 2000 or something like that. And this graphic was right side up in the older version, but every PowerPoint from 2003 onward turns this graphic upside down. I don't have any problems with any other of the graphics in any of my PowerPoints. Just this one. But I originally had it in there right side up. But it's like, you know, is it really worth bothering trying to fix it? So it gets turned upside down for some deep, dark reason buried in the code of the software. Or take an idea of infinity, right? Everything is finite in this world. And so how do we get an idea of infinity? Well, here again, Locke says, we start out with something that's limited, like limited space, or limited duration in time, or limited number, right? And then we, by our imagination, repeat and compound those ideas until we reach an idea of unlimited space, you know, infinite space, or infinite duration in time, or infinite number. So he says we start out from what our senses do provide us with, and our mind, by the imagination, can kind of work on these things. And so you see what Locke is arguing, that we can build these ideas that the rationalists say can only be innate from the data of experience. And so this is part of his case against innate ideas. Or even, and we're not going to spend a lot of time, but he says even the idea of God. We saw in the ontological argument from Descartes, listing the attributes of God, right? That and God has principles of necessary existence. God is eternal, all-knowing, all-powerful, infinitely wise. And Locke says, well, even our idea of God does not have to be innate. It can be generated from what we experience. From limited existence, we can imagine what necessary existence would be. That is, contingent existence. Like, none of these, you know, tables and chairs are necessary. They're all contingent. There was a time when they didn't exist. And there will be a time in the future when they grow old and they're thrown away or they're recycled and they won't exist. You know, there was a time when that building across the street didn't exist. But there's no necessity to their existence. But he says from limited existence, we can imagine what necessary existence would be. And again, you know, from limited duration in time, we can imagine eternity. It's kind of interesting in Revelation when the word eternity is talked about. The actual Greek word is aionion to ioniu, into the age of ages. In other words, it's not actually a concept of infinity, but an age of ages put together. And we say, well, God knows everything. Well, we say, well, we know what it is to know some things and have limited knowledge, so we extrapolate that out. Similarly, with limited power and the divine attribute of being all-powerful. And so Locke then tells us a story of how he thinks we can come by our senses to have ideas that the rationalists argued have to be innate. Now here's a very famous quote. Part of understanding Locke's essay is to understand that he uses the idea in a very broad way that is much broader than we normally use it. In other words, the word idea becomes for Locke a technical term. And for Locke, this is sometimes called the theory of ideas, this view that Locke has. It's the view, what an idea is for Locke is the immediate object that our minds are acquainted with when we perceive or experience anything. It's an intermediary between us and the world. Our mind doesn't immediately experience the external world. Now, we think we do. Now, it turns out that we're right and the empiricists are wrong, you know, as contemporary philosophers like Hilary Putnam state. But their contention is the mind experiences only its own inner ideas. So for Locke, an idea is whatever is the object of the understanding, again, is kind of like the part of us that's aware of the world around it. You know, the most inner part of us. The part of us that experiences the world. It's whatever is the object of the mind or the understanding when a man thinks. And here he, of course, means man in the generic sense, right? Men, human beings. Another way he describes an idea is whatever it is which the mind can be employed about in thinking. That is, whatever we have experiences or thoughts about, for Locke, are ideas. And the way I like to talk about this is Locke's concept of an idea includes everything and the kitchen sink. Because for Locke, the kitchen sink would also be an idea. You know, it's very broad. So here are some of the diverse types of experiences that for Locke we count as an idea, as an immediate object that our mind is acquainted with. We use idea for abstract thoughts, right? Like 2 + 2 = 4. But for Locke, something like the smell of spring flowers would be an idea. My memory of the smell of flowers would be a different kind of idea. The sight of a bird. Ideas can also come from inside us for Locke. I was trying to run and grab something at the farm store this morning, hoping that the bus didn't come in the meantime. I managed to slip on the steps, which is not good for an old guy like me. You know, and so I hit my, you know, just caused some pain. So if I have a pain in my knee, that's an inner sensation, but it's still for Locke an idea. Or feelings of warmth and cold. Those are ideas. A memory image. If I remember having been here, you know, on Monday, that also is an idea. So you can see that for Locke, you know, they are any kind of thoughts or experiences that could be in our minds. Now, see, the problem this poses for perception is if the mind is acquainted only with its inner ideas, how do you argue from knowing and being acquainted with the idea to knowing something beyond it? See, you and I, the empiricists, both back here and even empiricists in the early 20th century, thought that it would be a brash assumption to say something like, I know material objects exist. What I know exists are my own ideas and what later King calls perceptions. You know, but I try to infer that material objects exist. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 9 of us here, right? Now, you know the experience I'm having with the bookcase is different from the way you see it back there or the way you see it on this side of the room, right? Now, the way Locke and the empiricists look at that is each of us is acquainted with a private mental image of the bookcase. What we're going to see Locke calls a compound or composite idea. And Locke claims that that image represents the real bookcase in the real world. I mean, I think I asked this once before. Has anyone ever seen the president sleep in person? I mean, I haven't, right? I don't, you know, so I've never seen President Obama in person, but yet I'm confident that I know what he looks like. You know, if he walked into this room, I'd probably recognize him, and so would you. Why? Because you and I have seen images in newspapers, on the internet, on the television of the president, and they represent what the president looks like. Well, this is Locke's view of how we perceive the world, that we have like a private mental image, and the reason you experience this slightly different than the way you do and the way I do can be accounted for by the fact that we have different private mental images. But for Locke, those all represent one and the same real book bag in the real world. Now, this is not the common sense view, right? The common sense view is what later came to be called the adverbial theory of perception. In other words, if we're all experiencing the same thing directly, how come we have different experiences of it if it's all the same bookcase or you know, book bag? Well, the way the empiricists answer that is we have different experiences because we have different private mental images depending on our location. And that's what our minds, our understanding is immediately acquainted with. But, you know, the alternative view, which these people criticize, they say, you know, poor, naive, unthinking people out there on the street, they think when we look at the book bag, we actually see the book bag itself directly, not a representative internal image. But we know as philosophers that's wrong. That can't be right. We have to be experiencing a private mental image. Well, it turns out, you know, that probably the alternative view, the common sense view of the average man or woman from the street is probably right here, and the philosophers are wrong. We do experience the external world directly. There's no problem about there being a real material bookcase. And you say, well, but how is it if we're all experiencing the same object that we're having different experiences? Well, we're experiencing the same object in different ways depending on how we're oriented in relation to it. But on Locke's view, we're experiencing different private mental objects. And the problem comes when you have to philosophically reason from, I have a mental image of a book bag in front of me, to that mental image represents a real book bag in the real world. And we'll see the problem comes in the fact that you never can get beyond your inner perceptions for the empiricists. Hume especially accents it. So ideas then are the immediate object of perception, and we get them from two sources. I'm not going to dwell on this, but sensation is Locke's term for how we obtain the ideas we get from observations of what goes on around us. Reflection is supposed to be the mental analog of making empirical observations about the world. In other words, the idea that they thought we could introspect on what's going on in our own minds. And when we do that, we see that the mind has various mental operations, like perceiving, doubting or affirming something, believing something, reasoning, knowing something, willing something. We see, so we get ideas internally, or we can have an idea of something like warmth or pain. So, this is a good place. Let's see. Let me just go over one or two more slides. So ideas come from two sources, and there are two kinds, simple and complex ideas. A complex idea is built up out of simple ideas. So the idea is, if I experience like an old-fashioned telephone, look around. There's a time, if I teach long enough, when I'm going to put a slide like this, and with a heading like my idea of the red telephone is a complex idea. As soon as they're going to say, Mr. Rossi, where's the telephone? I see it there. I mean, the old ring telephone is going the way of the 8-track tape player, right? I mean, it's hard even. Try to go in an average store and buy a regular telephone to plug in. It's a challenge nowadays. But at any rate, what Locke is going to say is we experience complex ideas, but they're built up out of simple ideas that relate to the various properties of a thing, like the red color of the telephone, its shape, whether it feels cool or hard to touch, what size it is, weight, sound, and things. So we'll look at that before, and it's these distinctions, even though it looks like you're examining the leaves on the trees, that lead Berkeley to claim that there is no such thing as a material world with material objects. Everything is mental. There's nothing beyond the ideas. Our mind's acquainted with ideas that are directly put in our minds by us or by God, but there is no material world. And it led Hume to say, if all we know are what Hume calls perceptions, which is basically the way his term for what Locke talks about as ideas. If the mind is acquainted only with perceptions, Hume says it can't get beyond them to defending the existence of a real material world. And so Hume says, I'm going to be skeptical about it. Maybe there's a real world that's represented by my internal images of a book case, and maybe there isn't. And so while these distinctions seem picayune and little, that led to some pretty radical things in philosophy, some pretty radical views, you know. Okay, look, have a great weekend. Like I say, I'm going to probably post at least a sheet of essay questions later this afternoon. The test is probably, like I say, it's on your syllabus for a week from today. It's probably going to be a week from Monday. But if I post the essay questions today, you'll have 2 different weekends to decide when you want to work on your essay for test 2. But I need to postpone it a little bit so we have enough to give you a test on, right? Because we had spring break, we haven't had that many classes since test month. You know, so that's another reason why we're postponing. Okay, have a great weekend, and thanks a lot for coming. If anyone missed the roll, it's up there.